Thank you, Senator Markey, for your comments, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Thank you to Senator Rubio for his Uyghur forced labor bill, and I hope that receives the support from our colleagues that it desperately needs. This is obviously a topic of interest to the world at large because it concerns some of the most heinous human rights abuses on the planet today. And they're being carried out by a highly developed nation that's also trying to promote itself as a model to nations around the world. Of course, many of the Chinese Communist Party's outrageous actions are well known by others. Its censorship, its incarceration of journalists, its repression of religion, its oppression of all minorities, its surveillance of its own citizens. But when it comes to its genocide of the Uyghur people, China has largely been able to hide what it's perpetrating from the world at large. From the concentration camps and forced labor, to families being torn apart, to Uyghur women being sexually abused by Han Chinese, what the Communist Chinese Party is perpetrating on the Uyghur people is atrocity not seen or imagined coming from a nation in the modern era. Our hearing today is meant to inform us on the conditions and treatment of these people and to help us consider steps that can be taken to end this abuse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Zenz, a question to you, and perhaps two questions to you. Normally, practices such as this would yield extraordinary outpourings of anger and angst from people around the world. The governments would be very angry and would express this in many ways, given what's happening to the Uyghur people. So I guess I'm asking you to help analyze the mind of Xi Jinping and the Communist Chinese Party. Why do you believe they felt they could go ahead and do this? What's their purpose for doing so, and why do they think they'd get away with it? And secondly, and this may be impossible to predict, but who's next? Given what they've done to Tibet, what they're doing with the people of Hong Kong, what they're doing to other ethnic minorities within China, what they're doing with the Uyghur people, who might be next? So again, two parts. One, why are they doing this? And two, who's next?
Yes, thank you. I'll quickly respond to the second question, who's next? I believe anyone who is next who is systematically acting not in line or even in discord or even against the Chinese government in a more organized or institutionalized way. And I'm thinking of instituted religion, be it Falun Gong, house church Christians, Muslim groups outside of Xinjiang. Even Marxist students have been targeted. I predict, to also answer that question, I predict that the current increasing repression, not just of Uyghurs and Tibetans, but of anybody within the Chinese Communist Party control, is going to spiral into increasing paranoia of control. Because that's the tendency, that's the historic precedent. If you look at Stalin, if you look at Hitler, if you look at these autocrats, there's a repression only begets more repression, and control begets a loss of trust, which actually makes repression worse. And who's to say who's next in line in this, in what I believe is a growing paranoia within the regime? The question of why, and especially the Uyghurs, is because the Chinese government did realize at some point that they had lost control. They were not going to win over the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs were too concentrated. Here we're looking at the issue of population, the human threat. So Uyghurs is one of the largest ethnic groups. It's 11, now close to 12 million people, growing at a good speed. Many academic studies that I've researched say the Uyghurs are too concentrated. It's almost impossible to penetrate, break up the society. It's almost impossible to dilute the negative effect of their religion. And so the breaking up and the breaking of this large entity that has engaged in various, including violent acts of resistance against repression. Basically, Xinjiang's geopolitical importance was always high, but further increased with the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, Xi Jinping's drive to just have complete control. And so this initiative is a long-term experiment to, for good, really deal, break, and assimilate, and to some extent destroy the group's entity and identity as a group. Of course, we see some application of that elsewhere. Tibetans are also subjected to coercive assimilatory pressures on an unprecedented scale. It's like a micromanagement of poverty alleviation, really managing people's livelihoods and changing them for good. And so Xinjiang is in some sense a laboratory, but the reason is the Uyghurs are concentrated, there's many of them, they have shown great resilience to assimilation, and they did engage in targeted acts of violent resistance, albeit not of the nature the government claims it to be as an organized terrorism, and that's why they were targeted.
Thank you. Ms. Abbas, let me turn to you for a moment. First, to underscore my and my colleagues' horror at what is occurring for your sister and your family. Our hearts bleed as we think of what you're enduring and what your family is enduring. Let me ask you whether, to date, whether any of the pressure that you're seeing from the international community has had any impact on lessening the abuses that the Communist Chinese Party is perpetrating against the Uyghur people. Has there been any reduction in the atrocities, or has it continued unabated?
We see some pressure coming out. You know, the Uyghurs, they were not allowed to go to mosques. Now they are calling them come back so they can tell the world, you know, they can show the world that the Uyghurs are still living normal lives. And also when there is a raise of the case of certain individuals, of family members who's being detained, they are showing the video clips or pictures or bring them out and speaking. So I'm sure they are paying attention, and sanctions always work, but you know, should be continue of sanctioning the perpetrators, the officials, and also their children should not be allowed to enjoy the freedom that we have in the United States or you know, other parts of the world. So more sanctions will be helpful. Whatever we can to take tangible action to stop this genocide. You know, as our wonderful panelists here, Dr. Sophie Richardson and Adrian Zass's great work, we see that the Uyghur women's bodies are the battleground in this genocide right now. And if this continues, might be, you know, it will be too late for the Uyghur people, but if we do anything to stop this evil regime right now, might not be too late to save the future of this free and democratic world, which you know, our children and grandchildren will inherit from us. And everything that we have worked so hard on past 75 years, we can still save the free democratic world before the Chinese regime implements all that. As mentioned earlier, they tried with the Uyghurs and Tibetans, and now look at the Hong Kong, what's happening in Hong Kong. And also they are exporting the surveillance system and even maybe the slave labor, forced labor to other countries as well, while they are, you know, already exporting the surveillance system to more than 18 countries, as we know. So it is very critical for us to take this last chance to stop this and save the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, I was not familiar with the deportations of Uyghurs to China. What is the purpose of that from the Chinese standpoint? Is it to silence outspoken individuals, or is it to try and bring all Uyghurs back to China? What is the intent, do you believe, of this effort?
Senator, it's a peculiar pathology. You know, most governments, when people flee, are fine for them to go. They don't want them back. Yeah. And it's also peculiar because the people who have been forced to return are not necessarily political activists or known government critics. Many of the cases that we know about are simply ordinary people. They're business people, they're scholars, they're, you know, not sensitive in any particular way. And so we can only conclude that the Chinese government's goal is to try to forcibly return all Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims to the country so that they're unable to share their stories with people outside. And I think that's a very frightening impulse, and the fact that so many governments have complied with it and assisted it is very worrying.
Yeah, I have no sense of the extent of the Uyghur diaspora and where Uyghur individuals have gone to, where they live. Do you have any sense of sort of what the population of diaspora is and where it might be concentrated, if it is concentrated?
Well, the largest communities are here in Germany and Turkey and in Australia, but the places where we're seeing problems are, or I have to say, I'm sure there are people being sent back we'll never know about, particularly from Central Asia, for example. Shanghai Cooperation Organization states that are not exactly, devoted adherents of human rights or refugee policy. But some of the cases that we've seen recently, people in Pakistan, people in West Africa, in various Gulf states. We'll never know how many people got sent back. It's only in, I would say, the last 7 or 8 years, and partly due to the rise of social media, that people in distress are able to telegraph what's happening to them, which allows the other people in the diaspora and organizations like ours to get on the phone and start making noise so that people don't get sent back, but we don't always succeed.
Dr. Zenz made a comment a moment ago that struck me very powerfully, and that is that what we're seeing is mass atrocity without mass slaughter. It's the atrocity of genocide without the attendant slaughter of genocide. And this deportation effort from nations around the world is one, the sense that there really is an effort to not only eliminate the Uyghurs in China itself, but to eliminate them throughout the world. It reminds us of a period in the history of the world which is abhorrent, and it is going on. And most of the nations of the world have normal relations with the country that is doing this. It's extraordinary. The Senate just passed legislation mandating a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games in Beijing, and which I believe is very appropriate. And I know there's concern about sponsorships and trying to encourage companies not to sponsor the Olympics. The challenge, by the way, given the way the Olympics works, is that the companies buy sponsorships for multiple games, so they can't pick and choose a particular country. That's to prevent them from doing what we'd like them to do here, which is boycotting China's games. But are there things we need to do or be aware of to prevent China from being able to hide from the atrocity of the Uyghur circumstances as the Olympics arrive? Are there efforts that come to your mind that we should have in mind to try and draw attention to, as opposed to prevent the hiding of what's happening to the Uyghurs? Please, yes, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you. We talked about the Olympics a little bit, I think, Senator, while you were voting. I think there are a lot of things that the U.S. can and should do, and I think these Olympics are going to be a consular challenge of enormous proportions. Let's imagine, for example, U.S. athletes who go and want to, post on social media that they expect to be private concerns about Uyghurs, or they're asking questions, or they're simply having conversations with their family members that authorities decide are problematic.
And they could be arrested for doing so.
Well, they could
under Chinese law.
They should expect to be surveilled without question. Yeah. But it's worth pointing out that we did write to all of the top sponsors and to NBC asking what their human rights due diligence strategies were around these games, and none of them has replied.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.